Hello students, and welcome to our video lecture today in Module 9. In Module 9 we're going to be studying or continuing our study of the self-determination principle and exploring whether and to what extent U.S. law and policy complies with the UN standards on self-determination. And we're going to, in this module, attempt to understand the fundamental right to self-determination in both domestic law and international law. And today we're going to go a little bit more deeply into the indigenous right of self-determination. In past lectures and reading assignments, we've traced the development of the indigenous right to self-determination as an international law concept. We've looked at how it's the general right as well as the indigenous right to self-determination has been put into UN treaties, and we've traced the development of the indigenous right to self-determination as a norm in customary international law. And today we're going to try to go a little bit deeper into the indigenous right of self-determination and its place in modern international human rights law. And here I want to try to summarize, if I can, a reading assignment regarding James Nia's observations about the concept of self-determination in the reading assignment. Chapters 3 and 4 of his book, Indigenous Peoples in International Law. Then we will define or attempt to define self-determination in U.S. law and policy. And finally, the third thing we want to do today is then to compare the indigenous right of self-determination in modern international law, and especially the UN standards of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with extant U.S. law and policy. So let's begin then by defining self-determination in modern international human rights law. And we have previously examined the self-determination principle that is found in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think we can turn you to Article 3 and just direct your attention to Article 3 of the Declaration. And it states, indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. On a larger scale, we've seen earlier in this course that the concept of self-determination is a fixed principle in international law of the highest order. First of all, on the level of the nations, each nation has its own right of self-determination as the principal attribute of the tribal sovereignty principle, which is the primary engine of international law governing the relations among nations. But on the human rights level, we also see self-determination being a universal human right of all peoples of humanity, to the extent that it's even been described as a peremptory norm in international law, customary international law. And as far as indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, we've studied the evolution from a emerging norm into a norm in customary international law. And certainly we have looked at its role in the UN Declaration as being the core principle, or the core establishing the framework for human rights within this self-determination principle. And so basically, as a human right, the right of self-determination simply means that all peoples, that is, all groups of people with a common heritage, language, history, are entitled to two things as a human right matter. First, to be in control of their own destinies, and secondly, to live within governing structures devised accordingly. This notion, or this definition, is a core principle in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It provides the basic framework for the human rights of indigenous peoples, in that no other human right that is listed in the Declaration can be realized without self-determination. And in that sense, all of the articles in the Declaration are linked to the self-determination principle in one way or the other, and serve to elaborate on the principle of self-determination and define its elements. And as we've seen in the Declaration, the indigenous right of self-determination is exercised through self-government, through indigenous institutions, and it's linked to other key provisions of the Declaration regarding the right to culture, the right of political participation, the right to development, the right to lands and resources, and so on and so forth. Anaya, in his reading assignment today, in his chapters 3 and 4, goes deeper into the self-determination principle to look at the character and scope, as well as the contents of the self-determination principle, its application to indigenous peoples, and he also identifies the norms in customary international law that are related to self-determination. And we want to basically summarize that reading assignment today, and begin now by looking at Professor Anaya's observations regarding the character and scope of self-determination in international law. And he begins his analysis by observing generally that the self-determination principle in international law derives from two core values or concepts. The first being freedom, and the second core value being equality. And he explains that self-determination then derives from a freedom, specifically that human drive to aspirations, plus the power to convert an aspiration or a dream into reality. and that is the essence of freedom. Um, and that this equality principle, according to Anaya, refers to the inherent human equality that we can see, in international law. These two precepts, freedom and equality, really comprise undergird the principle of self-determination. And Anaya goes on to point out that the denial of these two precepts, freedom and equality, prompted the American Revolution and as well as the French Revolution, and notes that these two precepts are linked to the Western liberal democratic ideals that we see in political science among the nations of the West, and that these principles, or precepts, if you will, found their way into international human rights law after World War II. Prior to that time, international law was devoted exclusively to the relations among nations, and human rights of its citizens fell outside the purview of international law. But that changed after World War II, when international law grew and expanded to include the human rights of individuals vis-a-vis their own government. So Anaya also goes on to observe, that the human right of self-determination is not separate from other human rights. Rather, self-determination is a configurative principle or a framework that is complemented by more specific human rights norms. And so that we can't view the human rights principle in a vacuum. We have to also understand it against the backdrop of closely related human rights norms that give self-determination its content and character. And so turning back to the Article 3 definition then of the Declaration, as I've mentioned, it reads that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. And by virtue of that right, they can do two things, basically. First of all, freely determine their political status, and then secondly, freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, sort of on an ongoing basis. And the language in Article 3, this definition is the same language in other UN treaties. And Anaya points out that this definition basically has substantive aspects to it as well as remedial aspects to it. And the substantive aspects of self-determination are essentially that universe of human rights precepts that stem from freedom and equality, and the norms and the preemptory norms and the human rights treaties that grow out of notions of freedom and equality form the substantive aspects, in a broad sense, of self-determination. And at minimum, Anaya points out that these substantive aspects of self-determination means or requires a government order by which people can live free, that is government by the collective will of the people, with political participation and consultation built into that notion, that so that they can live free within a government order. And secondly, that the government order has to allow people to freely develop. That is, to make meaningful choices in all matters affecting their lives. And so for that reason, the Article 3 says that by virtue of this right, indigenous peoples have the right to freely determine their political status, i.e., participate in developing their political status and their relationship to their larger nations here. And secondly, to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And all of the other rights within the Declaration put flesh on these substantive aspects of self-determination. Secondly, Anaya points out that the definition of self-determination also contains some remedial aspects that arise or come to the fore when the conditions in a particular government deviate from the self-determination norm or violate the substantive elements of self-determination. That is, conditions of oppression, coercion, the absence of freedom, colonialism, governments that suppress self-determination norms, give rise to certain remedial aspects within the definition of self-determination, in that in those instances, international concern will provide some remedial prescriptions. This can include decolonization, as seen in the UN Decolonization Resolution. This could include the right of succession from governments that suppress human rights. This could include humanitarian intervention, embargoes, even direct military intervention. It could include aid, international aid, and also indirect international humanitarian intervention by way of the court of public opinion. These remedial aspects could mandate changes to the political order that are necessary to effectuate self-determination. Changes that are mandated by customary international law and UN treaties, human rights treaties that are enforced by international mechanisms such as international monitoring bodies, international tribunals, or domestic enforcement engines as well. And so these changes that can be mandated form a remedial aspect of self-determination, and they come from the heightened special measures that can be found appropriately within international law to safeguard indigenous rights, for example. Special measures that are okay, they're permissible, and there's measures that are seen as belated nation building. So these, both these substantive aspects of self-determination as well as the remedial aspects of self-determination kind of give rise to a new rule in international law regarding the sovereignty principle. And that would be that the doctrine of sovereignty in international law is no longer an unfettered right of sovereignty by each nation, but rather sovereignty is conditioned by human right values. And this means that the sovereignty principles in international law can no longer uphold the subjugation of human rights, can no longer shield atrocity, but behind the shield of state sovereignty. And these sovereignty principles can no longer block international concern about the human rights of individuals or peoples. Anaya goes on to look at the application of the self-determination principle to indigenous peoples. And recall, his textbook was had come out in the year 2004, a couple years before the UN declaration. But as of that date, his textbook, his treatise, traced the emerging norm of the indigenous right of self-determination towards becoming a norm in customary international law. And in his treatise, Anaya notes that indigenous peoples have a long history of the sui generis deviation from the self-determination standard. That deviation from this norm is a result of their situation within the classic colonialism framework, neo-colonialism, together with the settler state progeny from colonialism, in which indigenous peoples suffered and continue to suffer inequities within the nations in which they live, brought about by these historical patterns of empire and conquest, or the legacy of conquest that we talked about earlier in this course. And certainly in the declaration's whereas clauses, it certainly condemns colonialism, that legacy and the historic injustices in the whereas clause number 6 of the declaration, which reads that the General Assembly was concerned that indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices as a result of, inter alia, their colonization and dispossessions of their lands, territories, and resources, thus preventing them from exercising, in particular, their right to development in accordance with their own needs and interests. That this legacy has impeded their human right to self-determination. It's a long history, as found by Professor Anaya, that governments, even those free and democratic nations that were former colonies and settler states, have long resisted self-determination for indigenous peoples well into the modern era. And there's just been a very slow emergence of the indigenous right of self-determination into a norm in customary international law. And that I think is now behind us. I think with the defining moment, and the creation of this declaration and its approval in the year 2007, being endorsed today by 150 nations across the world. Anaya also identified the norms, the human right norms that elaborate on the elements of the indigenous right to self-determination in the reading assignment in Chapter 4 of Anaya's treatise. And he points out that this indigenous right of self-determination can't be understood alone, but it's got to be understood against the other human right norms that elaborate upon its elements and further define its content. And so these are the norms, kinds of norms that ensure ongoing self-determination for indigenous peoples that together comprise a body of norms that not only redress the historical and ongoing wrongs, inequities, and denials of the right of their self-determination, but elaborate on the requirements of self-determination. And Anaya identifies 5 norms, 5 such norms, all of which today are found in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The first norm is the equality and non-discrimination principle. And Anaya points out that this principle fosters the minimum conditions necessary in any society or nation to recognize indigenous human rights to self-determination and to protect the exercise of that right. Basically, we need a society, for a society to recognize that indigenous right, it must have the absence of discrimination against indigenous peoples. And certainly, as Anaya noted in his treatise, this equality and non-discrimination principle is a norm in customary international law. It's the subject of UN treaties, and it's certainly a principal theme found in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We'll be looking at this non-discrimination principle in our next module in more detail. The second norm identified by Anaya that elaborates on the self-determination principle is the right to culture, or cultural integrity norm. The human right to culture is very clearly a component of the indigenous right of self-determination. This principle requires nations to go beyond just simply protecting civil rights and political freedoms of its citizens, but to take the additional step to protect the cultural integrity of indigenous peoples and their right to culture, which is recognized as a norm in customary international law, a right protected in the CERD Treaty, for example, Human Rights Treaty, requiring signatory nations to respect and protect indigenous culture as part of the prohibitions against discrimination. The third norm that is related to the self-determination principle is the human right norm with respect to social welfare and development. That is the human right to freely pursue economic, social, and cultural development of all peoples, which is found in the UN Charter and literally joined at the hip to the self-determination principle, not only in the broader international human rights law, but also in the UN Declaration. The fourth norm that's related or elaborates upon the self-determination principle is the self-government norm. That is the political dimension of the right of self-determination, which includes not only self-government, but autonomy and indigenous institutions, coupled with the right of political participation in the larger system of government and political order, and the right of consultation together with its free, prior, and informed consent standard. And so this is the political dimension, I guess, of the indigenous right of self-determination. And then the fifth norm that is identified by Anaya is the norm associated with the right to land and natural resources. Anaya points out that this norm regarding land and natural resources is closely linked to the cultural and economic components of the self-determination right. Certainly, land and natural resources are the sine qua non, not only of cultural survival, but also of the subsistence of rights of indigenous peoples and their human right to property. I want to turn now then to from international law and international human rights law, in which this self-determination principle sort of creates a new rule and makes the sovereignty principle in international law subject to human right concerns, and especially the self-determination principle. To U.S. policy. Let's turn to U.S. law and policy now. And in the modern era of federal Indian law, as we shall see here, the cornerstone of federal Indian policy is the Indian self-determination policy that was first articulated by President Nixon in 1970 and implemented by hundreds of federal statutes in the modern era of federal Indian law. Secondly, we will see that the right of self-determination is one of the foundational principles in federal Indian law, arising from the doctrine of inherent tribal sovereignty. And we can also see that in the executive branch that self-determination policies are embraced through executive orders and agency policies as well, you know, government-to-government relationships, government consultation policies coming from the executive branch. At the same time, however, we can see when we survey the right of self-determination in U.S. law and policy, two basic problems in U.S. law regarding self-determination. First, the right of self-determination is not seen as an inherent human right. And in particular, this right of self-government has been declared by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Yakima case in 1978 as not being a fundamental right of Indian tribes. And further, the Supreme Court from Lone Wolf to the Martinez case has long held that Congress has the power to limit, modify, or even terminate the Indian right to self-government at will. And so for that reason, U.S. law does not see the right of self-determination or its political dimension as an inherent human right. And that's a big problem, I think. The second big problem is that U.S. law and policy certainly recognizes and protects many of the other norms that are related to and elaborate upon the self-determination right, such as non-discrimination, the right to culture, the right to land and resources, the self-government principle, autonomy, indigenous institution, political participation, and consultation, as well as the norm regarding social welfare and development, all of which will be looked at further in the next modules here in the course. But that in U.S. law and policy regarding these norms, our law falls short of fully complying with the UN standards in many respects, in several areas that need improvement, reform, or to be strengthened in order to comply with international law here as seen in the Declaration. And we'll study these further in the next couple of modules. But today we're going to focus on looking at federal Indian policy, the Indian self-determination policy, and the self-government principle found in federal Indian law. And that will be our focus today. So let's turn to U.S. policy. And here we need to look at President Nixon's Indian self-determination policy that's discussed at page 184 of the text, as well as in our assignment today. We were looking at, asked you to watch two panels on a video regarding the Nixon Forum, where they looked at the creation of Nixon's self-determination policy and how it was created and what its import and implications has been since 1970. In that video, you'll see that Sam DeLauria, who's one of our leading powerful minds in federal Indian policy, has described President Nixon's Indian self-determination policy as the gold standard, a gold standard in our law and policy here in the U.S. And in this policy, basically, the Nixon administration acted dramatically to end years of government termination and government paternalism from the nadir of Indian policy in the termination era in the 50s and 60s. He wanted to decisively end those policies with a dramatic new self-determination policy. And so he articulated an enlightened commitment way back in 1970 to self-determination policy that where the federal government was to promote and foster the right of self-government, more Indian control over federal programs that affect Indians, more control over their own destinies, their own priorities. And many of his rationales for this Indian self-determination policy rested on the same concerns that animates the UN Declaration. And if you'll look at page 184 of the reading assignment, it references some of the concerns that the Nixon administration had that animated the Indian self-determination policy. Look at note 8, footnote 8 on page 184. And if you'll go with me to the endnotes here in your textbook at page 317, you'll see endnote number 8. And there in the endnote number 8, it reads that President Nixon told Congress in a special message to Congress, a historic message, and I quote, that the first Americans, the Indians, are the most deprived and most isolated minority in our country. On virtually every scale of measurement, employment, income, education, health, the condition of Indian people ranks at the bottom. This condition is the heritage of centuries of injustice. From the time of their first contact with European settlers, the American Indians have been oppressed and brutalized, deprived of their ancestral lands, and denied the opportunity to control their own destiny. It is long past time that the Indian policies of the federal government began to recognize and build upon the capacities and insights of the Indian people, both as a matter of justice and as a matter of enlightened social policy. We must begin to act on the basis of what the Indians themselves have long been telling us. The time has come to break decisively with the past and to create the conditions for a new era in which the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions. Self-determination among the Indian people can and must be encouraged without the threat of eventual termination. In my view, in fact, that is the only way that self-determination can be effectively fostered. This, then, must be the goal of any national policy toward the Indian people, to strengthen the Indian sense of autonomy without threatening his sense of community. We must assure the Indian that he has control of his own life with without being separated involuntarily from the tribal group. And we must make it clear that Indians can become independent of federal control without being cut off from federal concern and support. In place of policies which oscillate between the deadly extremes of forced termination and constant paternalism, we suggest a policy in which the federal government and the Indian community play complementary roles. So these concerns which motivated the President Nixon's Indian self-determination policy are very, very similar to the concerns that motivated the General Assembly in putting that self-determination principle and framework into the core of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the whole framework for indigenous rights, human rights, in that international instrument. So we have a very similar set of policies here, animated and based upon very similar concerns, remedial concerns. And in the United States, the Indian self-determination policy has been implemented in large measure in the modern era through congressional laws. That is, acts of Congress that grant tribes increased control over Indian life, Indian property, the right to development, increased powers of governance. And these statutes, which are kind of summarized in short order at page 184, in footnotes 10 through 16, are federal laws that were passed during the modern era by a Congress that took its guardianship duties seriously and acted to effectuate the policy of Indian self-determination through a whole array of new laws that turned over federal program and services to Indian tribes, and the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, laws that gave tribes powers over Indian children and their well-being, the ICWA laws, a whole bevy of Indian Education Acts of Congress to strengthen education among the tribes, laws pertaining to the criminal justice system, reservation law enforcement, the administration of justice and tribal courts, most recently the Violence Against Women Act, provisions pertaining to Indian tribes in the criminal justice area, laws that foster Indian housing, that foster Indian health, laws granting more control over natural resources, and many, many laws pertaining to that protect tribal culture and languages, as well as economic development to foster and encourage and facilitate economic development. Indian Gaming Regulatory Act as well. Just many, many laws were passed during the modern era to implement this federal policy of Indian self-determination. The question that will be looked at in later modules here is how do these laws go far enough to actually create an effective right, effective human rights in all of these different areas. I think that we will see that we still have much more to go to strengthen our laws in many of these human right areas that are identified by the Declaration. The second way that this policy of Indian self-determination in the U.S. has been implemented is through Supreme Court decisions. And we know that the U.S. Supreme Court early on established this Worcester framework in which Indian tribes have inherent tribal sovereignty, that they exist within our political system as domestic dependent nations, which constitute separate political communities within our political landscape with the right of self-government and control over their internal affairs. And that under the Worcester framework, the U.S. has an obligation as the trustee or guardian to be a protector nation to protect the inherent tribal sovereignty of Indian tribes and these self-determination aspects of self-government here. And through that Supreme Court framework, which is essentially a federal common law that was derived from settled international principles of the day, bolstered by the U.S. Constitution, became part of federal Indian law. And so that in the modern era, we can see numerous Supreme Court decisions that implement and recognize and protect Indian self-determination. Certainly in the Cabazon Supreme Court decision that we looked at earlier, the right to development, the right to self-determination was expressly referred to in that opinion on gaming. We have Supreme Court decisions that are cited in Note 17 of the text today that recognize the power of Indian tribal governments to tax both Indians and non-Indians, the right of Indian tribes and their members to be exempt from state taxation in many respects, the right of tribal governments to regulate persons and activities within Indian country, doing business in Indian country, land uses within Indian country, the right of governments to punish both Indians who violate tribal law, but also now non-Indians, under the new Violence Against Women Act, Supreme Court decisions recognizing the sovereign immunity of Indian tribes and their tribal governments and instrumentalities of tribal governments, the indigenous institutions that form parts of tribal governments. So we have an array, a very impressive array of Supreme Court decisions that implement the federal government's policy of Indian self-determination. And this implementation is also seen in the executive branch through executive orders on consultation and the government-to-government relationship and the mandates to the agencies to effectuate these principles, in agency policies and practices. So we have the implementation of this policy by all three branches of the federal government. So we can also see that within that framework, that policy framework, that Indian tribes have made very striking nation-building advances within our U.S. Self-determination Indian policy. Advancing from 1970, when many places where tribal Indian tribes had very nascent governments and indigenous institutions in many places around the country, to the present day where we see these full service governments all around the country. Full service governments that with well developed executive, judicial, legislative branches of government that make and enforce laws that represent their citizenry with regard to political participation with the United States, that governments that create infrastructure, governments that have police departments, fire departments, tribal courts, natural resource programs that are often more professional than state natural resource departments, Indian Child Welfare Act offices, NAGPRA offices, housing departments, health programs, elderly programs, food service programs, tribal museums, tribal colleges, and just developing infrastructure through government, tribal government roads programs, utilities, water, providing water, and so these are full service governments in every sense of the word that are very sophisticated in the exercise of inherent tribal sovereignty today under the federal policy of Indian self-determination. And within that context, our indigenous institutions in the modern era have grown and blossomed, if you will. We have many tribes have archives, libraries, and museums, and traditional societies that transmit Indian culture and heritage to future generations. We have tribal colleges, we have tribal schools from K through 12, tribal businesses, and through this we've seen not only a cultural renaissance within this policy framework, but many tribes being the economic engines within the counties and communities in which they live. So we have the indigenous right, human right to self-determination on the federal level, implemented and elaborated on by a number of different norms. And then on the U.S. level, we have the federal government's Indian self-determination policy as implemented in the modern era. And I think that when we look at the overview and the general parameters of U.S. law and policy, we can conclude that generally our U.S. law and policy with regard to self-determination is generally consistent in principle with the self-determination principles of the UN Declaration, that there is general compatibility there, except in two critical respects. The first is that on the one hand, in the Declaration, the indigenous right to self-determination is described as an inherent human right. As such, inherent human rights or inherent rights are larger than the state, that they're indefeasible rights. They cannot be taken away by any government. They're inalienable, they're indefeasible, they're not subject to defeasance by a government. Whereas in U.S. law, the indigenous right to self-determination is not seen as an inherent human right. Rather, a Native American right of self-government, the focus of today, is subject to defeasance, modification, limitation, and even termination by Congress, and sometimes by the Supreme Court under its implicit divestiture doctrine to trim and pare back the exercise of self-government at the whim of a court judge subjective view. This legal status of the right of self-determination under U.S. law is seen and recognized by the Supreme Court in a whole line of cases, the Kagama, the Lone Wolf, and the Martinez line of cases that very clearly hold that the Native American right of self-determination, self-government, and associated rights, treaty rights, right to land, are all subject to control, modification, and even eradication by Congress, and also now by the U.S. Supreme Court in recent years. So, as a result of the Indian or American Indian right of self-determination not being seen as an inherent human right, the Indian right of self-determination in U.S. history, legal and policy history, has been subjected to wild pendulum swings in federal policy, swinging back and forth, zigzagging back and forth from the Worcester framework with its inherent tribal sovereignty doctrine and protectorate framework, swinging from that to the plenary power of Congress, the plenary federal guardianship control over Indian tribes to supplant their governments and exercise unfettered guardianship over Indian peoples and ways of life, and bringing enforced assimilation, Christianization by the government, civilization and tutelage policies, back to in 1934 rejecting those policies and trying to encourage tribal government, with the Indian Reorganization Act from 1934, using those kinds of policies all the way to 1950, when the policy swung back to termination and assimilation, through 1950 into the 1960s, zigzagging back to Indian self-determination in 1970. And these pendulum swings are not appropriate when inherent human rights are concerned, because it's really intolerable for an inherent human right to rest on such shifting sands and to zigzag back and forth between prevailing policies, prevailing prejudices of the day, the ever-changing political winds, And so I think that the impact of the Declaration, if it were implemented in the United States, would basically be to stabilize our indigenous self-determination policy in the United States, and that the notion of indigenous self-determination being an inherent human right would act to limit encroachment on that human right by the unilateral federal power to terminate or eliminate or limit the indigenous right to self-determination. So the Declaration then would be a stabilizing force. It would basically say that President Nixon got it right, that the Indian right to self-determination is appropriate in a post-colonial world, that we really need to uphold the Worcester framework and look at it as an inherent right of self-determination, or inherent tribal sovereignty, is very compatible. And so I think our challenge in the U.S. is to get the United States to recognize that this is an appropriate limitation on the power of the federal government that's placed on the United States by the human rights framework that comes to us from modern international human rights law, that we need to accept it as a legitimate limitation on federal power. And know that you can't have, on the one hand, an inherent right to self-determination, allowing tribes to determine their own destinies, on the one hand, and on the other hand, subject the tribes to the unfettered power of a conqueror. The two political conditions are mutually exclusive. And those doctrines in our U.S. law that sustain absolute power over Indian tribes and the divestiture of the indigenous right to self-determination without the free, prior, and informed consent of Native Americans are simply not in keeping with the way that democracies are supposed to act in the post-colonial age. And I think we can change that behavior, that national behavior, by incorporating the UN principles and simply recognizing that the goal in so doing by the UN General Assembly is to really to foster a more harmonious relationship between Native Americans and the federal government, which comes about when nations guarantee the human right of self-determination to indigenous peoples. And all that this norm would simply require the U.S. to do is to be a real protectorate of Indian nations as envisioned by Worcester. That is, we have assumed a duty to protect the political integrity and well-being of Indian nations. That was established through treaties and peace and friendship, and not oppress those nations, And so I think it's simply time to live up to the Worcester framework. The second way in which U.S. law and policy doesn't comport with the self-determination principles of the Declaration is that, as will be seen in modules 10, 11, and 12, U.S. law doesn't fully recognize the international human rights norms that elaborate on the self-determination principle in the areas of non-discrimination, the right to culture, the right to land and resources, the right to social welfare and development, and the right to political participation. We will see that our law and policy in those areas is not fully developed as inherent human rights would ask it to be. And so our comparative legal analysis between our law and the UN standards will continue in the next 3 modules. With that, I thank you for your kind attention once again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.